Welcome to the Anti-Architect Podcast. I am your host, Christian Giordano. As president and owner of the design firm Mancini Duffy, I am driven by a quest for learning and radically changing the industry. With this podcast, I'm hoping to improve the industry that I'm so passionate about by taking a critical look at how architects work through a variety of voices and shared experiences. Hello, Anti-Architect Podcast listeners. I'm excited to have Evelyn Lee, FAIA, as my guest here today on the Anti-Architect Podcast. Evelyn is the first ever senior experience designer at Slack Technologies, founder of Practice of Architecture, and co-host on the podcast Practice Disrupted. She has also had many of our Mancini folks on there as well over the past 2 seasons. Evelyn received her Bachelor of Architecture degree in 2002 from Drury University, where she minored in global studies while playing on the women's soccer team. In 2003, she received her Master's of Architecture degree from SciArc, and most recently in 2012, Evelyn finished a dual MPA, which is a Master's of Public Administration, and MBA, which is a Master of Business Administration in Sustainable Management. Lots of schooling. Evelyn also wrote a monthly column for Contract Magazine for over 3 years, and now is a frequent contributor to Architect Magazine. She has received numerous industry awards, including the 2016 40 Under 40 Award for Building Design and Construction. I actually received that in 2013. I have to go back and look. I'm older.
Following closely behind.
That's right. And in 2014, the AIA National Young Architects Award. She currently serves as the first ever female treasurer on the AIA National Board from 2020 to 2021. Evelyn has nearly 20 years working with individuals and companies who are interested in applying design thinking to their design decision-making process, and she has been featured many times in almost all the well-known events, such as the AIA National Convention, Dwell on Design, and many others. And most importantly, she is a wife of a Special Forces veteran and a mother of 2 children. Evelyn, I'm sure I missed a bunch here because you do so much. Thank you for taking the time to be on the podcast.
I'm surprised I gave you my long bio. I'm sorry.
No, not at all. That's awesome. I'm actually really curious. Where was your husband stationed with the Special Forces? What's his name?
So his name is Ryan Natoka, and he was mainly based in Asia. So we met after he retired from the Special Forces and business school.
Okay, wow.
So I was not a part of his life while he was going through that.
Okay.
But yes.
Wow, amazing. Well, thank him for his service for us, please.
Absolutely.
So in reading your bio, you're FAIA. So I'm curious about that because you're young with the FAIA status. I always think of that as like the super old architect thing, kind of end of career. How did that come about for you?
So technically, you can apply for fellowship 10 years after. So just 2 things. You have to have received your license and you have to have been a full-time AIA member. So 10 years after receiving your license and upgrading your membership to AIA from associate AIA, you're eligible to apply for fellowship. So I think a lot of people do look at it like a career end or on that, that side of the career spectrum. Mm-hmm. But the funny thing is kind of, if you look at I don't think it's officially called mission or values, but if you look at what the College of Fellows is trying to do, it's ongoing. They actually encourage all of their fellows to continue to be mentors, and really continue to raise the profession and educate those that are following them. Mm-hmm. So I see it kind of as a point in time, and this is just like an ongoing call of service back to the profession to continue to teach and engage the future, and in my case, hopefully change things going forward.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's awesome. So yeah, I guess I never really read through the actual rules of it. I just kind of assumed, and knowing so many of the, fellows, it seems to be later on in their career. So that's interesting.
They're encouraging
go ahead.
younger people to pursue it more. So if you
Makes
are,
sense.
if you're eligible, I'll help you put your hat in. So,
all right, perfect. Yeah. I love it. So let's kind of jump right into it. If you had to pick one thing, what annoys you about your fellow architects?
Oh, how we complain about everything, but then we don't do anything about it.
Good answer.
Is that too general?
I like that. No, that's perfect. Are you kidding me? It's very true.
More specifically, like if you want to get specific, like more about how we complain about everything we've given away and how we don't do anything to kind of reclaim any of that space or pursue anything new.
Interesting. So that's come up many times here on this podcast. Things like giving away project management. Even the project managers that I've had on have said, you've given away project management. Or the engineers have said, you've given away lighting design. You've given away, even just basic computation in some of the mechanical systems and things that you used to do. So it's absolutely true.
Yeah, but then my follow-up question is like, okay, then what are we going to do about it? And no one ever has a response to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think, well, we'll get into technology later, but I think that's where we can start to bring some of that back. So, in your opinion, what do architects do really well, and what do they do wrong, and what's kind of broken with the process?
So I think I've always felt that architects excel at two things. And I apply this to what I do too, even though I don't practice traditionally, right? We're systems thinkers, right? We look at the entire system. We can kind of understand all the moving pieces and how they need to go together to create some type of unity going forward. So whether that's the design of a business and operation system, which is where I tend to be, or a building, we have that ability to think big and still implement against that. The other thing is I think we're implementers. I worked as a strategy consultant for a long time. And the role that I was playing there isn't dissimilar from some of the workplace strategy and consultant that even, the McKinseys and the Bains and the Deloittes do. But the joke is that you go into these organizations and you're a strategy consultant and their strategy always gets shelved. But I was lucky enough to really be a part of organizations where I got to help through implementation. So if you think about from a building perspective, we always implement. Even if it's a single prototype, we still implement. So I think those are our two biggest strengths. But that was only part of your question. What was the other half again? You have to remind me.
Just in terms of the process, what do you think is broken with the process of, whether that's engaging an architect or whether that's how the architect works through the process with a client or into construction?
Okay, so I might step this out one more micro, and I would say that there's this weird competitive nature that we have in the profession that is really stopping us from growing as fast as we can, and from bringing together our collective minds to problem solve some of the things that we could do, right? Like I literally worked at a firm where they had everyone who entered sign an NDA before they entered into the space. And I don't know if it's built out of studio culture, because I hear studio culture is a lot more collaborative these days, but there's just like a lack of sharing, even within firms sometimes, which is really sad, but especially just across the profession, that I think would move us along so much quicker, and make us more agile and make us more adaptable in the end.
Yeah, we've talked about some other the IDP processes, or engineers working a little bit more closely with the architect directly and really being true team members. And I agree. I think that's where we lack. And yes, within the firms, at least my experience is we work very collaboratively on projects. And although you can have, studios that don't talk to one another, right, or there's an alienation, we've suffered from that at my own firm where, the base building studio feels disconnected or not a part of the interior studio. So we try to do a good job of mixing interior designers and, architects all together. My experience has been that an interior designer can pretty much do anything that an architect can do, and vice versa, right? So by kind of doing it all in the same team and mixing those roles up, especially if it's managing a project, I mean, the processes are pretty much the same. And yes, there's specialties and all of that sort of stuff. But an integrated team like that really begins to solve those communication problems for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I've seen firms where project managers are hoarding their detail libraries, right? They won't even share it across the firm, which is really tragic. I think that's the most tragic. But I also, we've had a lot of conversations with people that have moved into the tech space, and I'm in the tech space now. Mm-hmm. And there's this whole notion of open source and code, like, let's flip it and let's put the detail libraries out, right, to the public. If you've solved something that's really unique, like, why make another architect struggle through the same thing that you did to solve it? Let's share it so we can all move faster, quicker.
Yeah, absolutely. We had Christine from Building Fight Science Club?
Building Science Fight Club, yeah.
And I mean, that's her whole thing, is she's putting out the details that work, right? Hey, these are why they don't work. This is why they do work. And please use them, because it's just better for everybody. So I want to switch gears because I'm fascinated by culture in architecture firms. It's really my, it's one of my main things that me as now the owner of my company, I pride myself on. I think I do a good job. I think us as a firm does a good job. But if I have to be honest with myself, my opinion has changed from being the employee to now being the owner. And now even post-pandemic, right? And if I'm trying to be really super honest, right? I think of kind of our story let me back up. I think of my story as an employee, right? I worked at let's say 2 major firms throughout my career. One was Swanky Hayden Connell, big interiors firm. They also did some architecture. And I would describe that culture as fun. Everybody had a great time and loved working there. It was sort of like work hard, play hard. And actually, I met my wife there. I know a ton of people that met their spouses there. And so that's kind of the culture that existed. And I worked at HLW, big international firm, which was more serious. And you kind of made your own way there. And almost and I don't want to be, mean to them because it's not the case, but I loved it because I could make my own way and kind of nobody got in my way, right? But then there's others that failed at that. So in coming to Mancini, when I became the owner or one of the owners, we wanted to do a combination of both, right? This fun place to work and then this, kind of being able to find your own path. So we came up with obviously the cultural values and things that we wanted to make important. But then this entrepreneurial idea that if you had an idea, whether that was for technology or that was for a market sector or that was for, you're a young project manager and you have this idea, we wanted to hear it, right? And we wanted to and I think that's where we've been most successful, because if I'm being honest, the fun is great, but I don't think it keeps people at a firm for the long haul. So anyway, that's a long kind of intro, because I know you've written about this, you've spoken about it a lot, and I just want to hear your take on culture, the values that companies, the architecture firms put out, the attrition. I know you've talked about a culture deck, and how do we do better, as a group when it comes to culture? Because you are working late nights. No matter what I do, everybody has to work late and work hard. And yes, we give days off. Yes, we try to reward people. But in the end, that is our profession.
Yeah, that's a sad state. No, but it's so, wow, so much to unpack in everything that you just said. So the interesting thing is, I think a lot of people, when they say the culture suffered during the pandemic, right, they tend to refer to all the social activities, and I know you guys you have that one genius person that does drinks, right, on Friday. Jessica always tells me about how this, and I was like, oh, I want to tune in, but I have yet to tune in. But anyways, it sounds amazing, right? But of course, that is like not the same as in person. But I think, when people talked about the lack of culture happening during the pandemic, it was really all about kind of the socialization and events. When I think of culture, when I think of values, when I think of how they play out, especially in technology, it's ingrained into every single thing that we do, right? Culture is not purely social events. It's how we interact with one another. It's how we interact with our clients. It's how we decide which clients to actually pursue. The other thing I say about culture and values is I can't for the life of me remember a single value statement out of any architecture firm that I've worked at, because I don't feel like we live in like a firm lives into those, right? They kind of publish them in the employee handbook. It might live on the website, but if you ask your staff, like, what are the values of the firm? I don't know if they can recall it, right? But with Slack, it's like built into everything we do. So empathy, courtesy, thriving, craftsmanship, playfulness, solidarity. And one of the examples that I always give is we are a software company. So, every software company, software as a service companies, they do these updates, right? Like updated security patch 1.5 is usually the update. That's the bottom line. So Slacks, though, is like, we found that you guys were having problems when you did this. And because of that, we've gone ahead and update security patch 1.5. Like, let us know if you're like run into the situation again. But like for me, that's our culture showing up in a very public way to our clients. And that's why I think it's like there's an ability to cultivate that type of culture in a hybrid practice. Yes, culture is like maybe easier to cultivate in person, but I don't think we're losing anything, a piece of culture going to hybrid or remote or a combination. But it really has to be foundational to everything you do, and you really have to live into those values. And I don't think architecture firms do.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, especially on the values. So I'm in an organization called YPO, Young Presidents Organization, and they're very big in this organization, globally on coaching. Right. And there's YPO preferred coaches and there's all the different methods, the scaling up, the Rockefeller habits, the EOS. I'm sure you've heard of all of these kind of things. And, we had a coach, and I think the coach really helped us. It was years ago, and really helped us kind of define who we were. But those core values that we established, and we still, is very similar. I mean, and I'm being 100% honest and transparent. We're the same way. We publish them, we talk about them, but we don't live by them. And yet, I interviewed someone from the one of the owners of Philip Jeffries' wall covering. And, he talked about his core values just like you did. He rattled them off, and then he talked about how they were in every single thing that they do as a company. And so I feel like that seems to really work well for every other company except for an architecture firm. Like, what's going on?
But I think it's just because I feel like anything that's not project related is secondary to an architecture firm, right? Which includes all operations, policies, and process, unless it drives real tangible productivity. And I also think architecture firms, just in general, leaders in architecture firms aren't exposed to this type of, there's a long conversation about, additional business training in architecture school. But also, I mean, if you look at how leaders are brought up through architecture firms, and if your only view of leadership is those who came before you, and that's your platform for learning, things like this are not going to sneak into the profession unless you intentionally bring it in.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, that is pretty much everyone I know in my position is, we're as good as the leaders that we came from beforehand. And we've gone out knowing that because of things like YPO and exposure into that, knowing where the weaknesses were, knowing that we don't have a business background per se, and how do we, evolve ourselves to create something special. in the end. So I'm curious as to kind of, so that's a chapter we have not yet written. So I'll have to follow up with you on that, on how we can truly implement those values. Let's talk a little bit about, before we move off the subject, on the attrition side of things, because again, I feel like, someone told me this quote a long time ago, people don't leave companies, they leave leaders. And that's always stuck with me. And so I take it very personally when somebody leaves our company. I know I probably shouldn't at this point, but I do. And, but we're in a weird time right now, whereas in talking to many, many other architecture firms, there are so many people kind of leaving the profession in general, not necessarily to go to another firm. Do you have any insight as to kind of why that's been going on?
Yeah, well, I mean, right now, so we're in the middle of the Great Resignation. I want to say some people are calling it the reimagination too. But the Atlantic even just said, it's not just architecture firms, right? So the Great Resignation is people quitting in numbers never seen before, right? And the Atlantic literally just released an article last week saying that the numbers of people quitting are accelerating. So the data numbers are trailing for them. So that was August statistics. And there's an interesting quote in there that said, quitting used to be associated with losers and people who have just given up. But this level of quitting is a sign of a need for things to change and evolve. So I don't, yes. And so I guess the only comfort is that it's not happening just in the architecture profession. It's everywhere. But, being somebody who has transitioned out of traditional practice, I've definitely been getting a lot more pings on my LinkedIn, outreach saying how did you do that? I want to go into tech. What's the move? What can I do outside of architecture? So I think there's just people seeking different things and different opportunities. And they're also seeing in the news, all of these companies offering greater flexibility, remote working options, things that architects, are struggling with now, but pre-pandemic, it would have been an absolute no. So, yeah, it'll, and architecture firms have to adapt. I think the real takeaway there is we are no longer, and as people see the value that architects can bring as systems thinkers, but as people see the value that architects can bring as system thinkers and more people outside the industry are beginning to hire architects, we're no longer competing with one another for talent, right? Mm-hmm. We're competing with a much broader, we're competing with everyone for talent.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So our audience would love to get to know you a little bit better. Can you tell us a little bit about, growing up and your childhood, what your parents did?
I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, which is an unusual small town to grow up in. I think we have the highest number of PhDs per capita because of the labs there. So small town Los Alamos means fast food joints don't survive because people want to go out and enjoy restaurants where you have sit down and have nice dinners. It also meant that for a small town, it was incredibly diverse. And both, as you can imagine, both of my parents work at the lab. So my dad used to be a part of X Division, which is actually, I'm not going to say what, you guys can look that up. I guess I'm not going to just say it out loud. And then my mom actually did tech support for the lab, which is I can't imagine her incredible brain, but she essentially knew, she had 4 different stations set up in her office and knew how to code and program so many different languages so she can offer technical support. Wow. So that was kind of my childhood. And my dad always, I think, encouraged me to be a physicist because he has his PhD in plasma physics. Then that didn't really happen. And then I don't know. I have one sibling. So I grew up there, got a soccer scholarship to go play at Drew University, which is oddly enough how I ended up at a small private liberal arts school that happened to have an architecture program. And I don't know how far and how
no,
detailed
that's
do
great.
you want me to
I would love to hear kind of like your evolution through your education path, right? From sort of that architecture school to your master's, and then definitely, what inspired you to go back for, the MPA and the MBA.
Yeah, wow. That could be an incredibly long story. I'll try to shorten it. So I think I was one of those people that like knew from the fourth grade. There's a handful of us that knew from a very young age we wanted to be architects, right? My story was, my teacher told us to draw our dream homes, and everybody drew an elevation, and I started like drawing and plan what I wanted the rooms to look like. So that's kind of my origin story there. And then I landed at Drury University, which is, I would say, was like really great environment to be in. It's not huge, right? I went through 5 years of undergrad with the same 25 people. That's essentially the size of each year of the program. But it's a lot more technical oriented. And I always had this notion that I wanted to teach, and I wanted to learn a lot more about the theoretical side. Details were never of interest to me. I should have probably keyed on that earlier in my career. So I ended up going to SciArc in California. So that's what brought me out to California. It was a 1-year post-professional program. There was this interesting scenario planning studio that I had at SciArc that really has become the basis of the work that I do today. At the time, the Valley was looking at seceding from the city of LA, and we were looking at the dynamics of what would happen if that happened. So, for instance, Parks and Rec, most of the parks and recreational, that was my focus, was in LA. So what does that mean for the Valley and how you support that system? Other people were looking at other things, like even garbage, because the Valley owns all the garbage for LA. So what does that mean for LA? But it was an interesting strategic and scenario planning, which is kind of at a larger scale, kind of what I do today. And I really wish, again, I keyed on that, like that my love for that studio. I entered the world in a bit of a dip in 2002, right? I just sought out the first job I could find, was at WD Partners doing site adaptations for Home Depots. Not very exciting. There are only like a few months in Alaska that you can break ground. So I did learn that. But then I went to work for a few other firms. I landed at Dougherty and Dougherty, doing K through 12 university in a lot of community buildings, because I thought this is going to be so much better than big box. But I didn't get the opportunity. I rarely got the opportunity to talk to students, right? And I had teachers complaining to me that I moved there, like they can't plug in the coffee machine where they plugged in the coffee machine before. And I was like, no, but now you have air conditioning and you have Wi-Fi in your classroom, and you didn't have that before, but never mind that. So it wasn't nearly as rewarding as I thought it was going to be, because I wasn't engaging with the end users. And I ultimately left. I said, my friend had an opening at a nonprofit organization, and there was an ability, they were recruiting architects to run, it was public architecture, which has since sunsetted. Okay. But they had a program called what was the 1%. They renamed it 1+, which they asked all of the architecture firms who signed up for this organization to give 1% of their billable hours towards the public good pro bono, which would make, if we did that, would make the largest pro bono design firm, essentially, collectively. Really interesting, but they were having problems finding projects to work on. So they essentially brought me on to bridge that gap.
Interesting.
And that was only ever going to be a 1-year situation. So I was like, this is really interesting. I'm talking to all these nonprofit organizations. I'm not speaking their language. I'm not talking to them about the value that they receive from architecture. How do I learn their language? And that's ultimately what drove me to business school. What I very quickly discovered is the MBA is very quant focused, for good reason. For me, the MPA was more, how do you quantify qualitative findings? So surveys, and how do you kind of maneuver through not over only government bureaucracy, where there's a lot of people that get MPAs and then go into like nonprofit or NGOs or government, but also like any politics that happen in a firm. So like a lot of organizational management training, essentially. So that's how I ended up picking up the dual degree. And then I landed at MK Think, co-leading their strategy group. And their strategy group was, interestingly enough, started because they felt architects are brought to the table too late. So we were seeking out services on both ends of traditional practice. Like, where can we make money and be involved pre-traditional services, and where can we make money and be involved post-traditional services? Sure. So I did that for 5 years. And then I went to workplace consulting at brokerage, which was really tough. I would not recommend any architects go work for brokerage on the consulting side. Plenty do. That was just a really tough 2 years for me because I had to, it was a lot of selling, and selling is not my favorite thing to do. And then I landed in-house at Slack Technologies, which was wonderful because I got to get rid of all time cards. And then I ultimately, I don't have to sell anymore, right?
So explain what Slack is for the audience, because I bet there's plenty that don't. I know for a fact someone that listen to this audience or listen in this to this podcast don't know what Slack is. Can you explain what it is?
So very simply, at its most basic level, Slack is a technology platform that allows people to communicate. So if you think about emails, they're really kind of silos of information that is only sent to the people who are CC'd in the email. But project development, and Teams does this too. I mean, let's be honest, but project development is really like, and making sure you have open, transparent communication is kind of about involving all the team as much as possible. And also giving a place where anyone who has not been a part of that team but needs to come in to substitute for any reason at any point in time can then see the history of everything that's happened. But just think about how much communication is lost in email, especially if you invite a new person to the party. So at a very high level, it's a communication platform. At a more sophisticated level, it can be your digital HQ. So Slack is really meant to sit horizontally across all of your other platforms. So for instance, there's a lot of apps that work in Slack, but the idea is you never necessarily have to leave Slack to access all these other apps. So there's a whole bunch of / commands that I can do to spin up a Zoom call, to look up client information, to I'm sure there's a time tracker in there. I'm glad I don't, literally I was so happy to get rid of time cards, but essentially you could do a / command and start up all these other a series of events. The other thing it can do is and the most amazing thing it can do is anything that you upload to a Slack channel or a project channel is then the content within it becomes searchable too. So it's not just the title of the PDF, it's everything within the PDF becomes searchable. So it's the new marketing lingo is it is your new digital HQ. We very much use it as our digital HQ. And we've been learning a lot more about how to use it as a digital HQ because we're very much an in-person company pre-pandemic.
Interesting.
And now we're calling ourselves a digital first company going forward.
Have you gone back to the office as a company?
No, we haven't.
Okay.
So we are saying roughly until February, but we're encouraging our teams right now to create new teaming agreements at the team level that begins to look and talk about what is the expectation of individuals coming back into the office. And some of our teams are actually looking at a cadence more of 2 to 3 days a month in person, and the rest of the time separately. We are a global company too, so we have a lot of distributed teams. So what does that mean for a team like my team? And only a quarter of us are in San Francisco, and the rest is distributed all throughout the U.S.
Okay.
So,
and so, what is your role there?
That's harder because I'm still trying to figure out my role. So, just because Salesforce acquired Slack.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of running two roles right now. So senior experience designer at Slack, and then my new title over at Salesforce is senior manager global operations workplace services. But if you just look at what I was doing for Slack, it's working cross-functionally with our building and design team, but also with our biz tech team, our operations team, our people development team, our people operations team, which is essentially HR, to look at the overall, our learning and development team, which is employee learning and development, but really look at the entire life cycle of employee from candidate to alumni, and how do you make that experience better? So in tech, I know architects are going to be like, what? But in tech, engineers change on average every 1.75 years. So like our ability to attract and retain talent is, really, really like par for the course when it comes to growing the business. So all of everything that we're doing, looking at the entire employee life cycle, is really like, how do we attract and retain the best talent, and then, put out the best product because of that.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So when you say you interact with the building design and construction team, what exactly does that mean?
So historically I've set a vision around like what an office should be. So we were looking at, we had a new office that was going to go into construction pre-pandemic. That has since been pulled, one, because of the acquisition, and two, just because we didn't actually start construction. But we set out an overall vision of what we wanted that particular office to be in Dublin. And, it was going like, it was a mix of our hospitality as like our EMEA HQ, essentially. But really, and then I'm a part of the RFP process when it comes to hiring the architects.
Okay.
But really, I'm just there kind of making sure, and my team developed the program for the building ultimately.
Okay.
But the rest of it, we have a project manager who is amazing. So he's the one doing all the coordination on the end. I feel like I get to do all the fun stuff, right? I get to interview our employees. I get to figure out what should our program be. And then I just kind of leave it. I get to select the architect, and I get to be a part of all of any fun design conversations I want to be a part of. But I've left kind of everything else that to the project manager to run the project itself.
That sounds like a fun experience for sure.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about your website, thepracticeofarchitecture.com, and then your podcast and the impetus behind the podcast and what you're trying to achieve with your podcast.
Yeah, so the practiceofarchitecture.com comes out of everything that I've learned, starting with being a strategist at MK Think, that we were able to charge a different rate than architects. We were providing expanded services within the structure of a traditional firm. Like, what are the learnings that other architects can learn from that? And how can we begin to take back all the things that we gave away, or create new services in places that we aren't really functioning right now? So that was the basis of Practice of Architecture. And it started out being more of like a collector of ideas and what I was seeing out there. And it's become a lot more hands-on. There's a community associated with it. You can be a part of the Practice of Architecture Lab to join forward-thinking architects. We're releasing courses and releasing AIA CEUs, specifically looking to expand the practice of architecture. And for me, Practice Disrupted, the podcast, is really just another way to elevate that conversation that we were having, right? It's just another medium. A lot of what we talk about isn't dissimilar from the business operations and policies that I was writing about in the Contract Magazine article. It's just like, it's a new forum. Not everyone is reading as much these days or picking up a magazine. So the podcast is a new forum to kind of deliver upon that and bring in real world examples of case studies of architects doing really interesting things, like Jessica Sheridan and Mancini and the tool set you guys have there.
Thank you.
So that was that's kind of, it's just a way to kind of expand the voice. But now Practice of Architecture is doing a lot more kind of one-on-one consulting and coaching and helping other architects along, but also creating a community of people that are forward thinking. I was surprised by how many of us there are out there. And I think we can do more collectively if we band together.
I totally agree. I mean, I know I associate with a lot of other architects that want to advance the profession, and want to advance it not only from the cultural side or from our work side, but the business side, but from the technology side. And I think you said it perfectly earlier. You do get consumed by the project, right? And in the end, at the end of the day, the project and the client are what kind of take over everything else. It all gets kind of shoved to the side. And us at Mancini, we've really said, no, that's not going to happen. We're pushing the technology side forward. It has to remain number one, even during the pandemic. I know a lot of companies kind of gave up on any initiatives that they had just to survive, which I don't blame them for. I get it 100%. But we made that commitment to no, we're sticking with the technology and the developers that were hired, and we're not going anywhere. And that, yes, that's unbillable work, but it's going to, help us in the future. And I think more companies need to do that. I think your podcast kind of helps with that dialogue as well. And so what other technologies do you see coming to help our profession or being developed, with our profession in mind, or being even developed in our profession, other than things like VR and 3D printing and AR and, artificial intelligence? Are there other things that you see kind of coming to light?
Yeah. Sorry for all this background noise. I think the kids just got home. Well, actually, I know the kids, I guess not a thing. They are obviously home now. I just gave a keynote not too long ago, really looking at what Web 3.0 is, right? And there is definitely a level of AI and machine learning built into that, and as well as VR. I guess you could go down the Facebook hole of, what's their new name again?
Meta.
Yeah, Meta. The meta actually, 3.0 actually is really about the metaverse. If you want to go down that hole, but there's I don't know if I'm the best person to answer this. Even though I'm in technology, there's a lot of VC funding that is being poured into the building space, like more so than ever before, right? And they're looking to increase efficiencies in processes. They are looking to increase efficiencies in how they deliver materials. So I think, and I don't, they're coming to the game with a lot more resources than we have ourselves as firms to put in. So I think if you want, so what tech, I mean, I don't think it's any big thing. I think it's a lot of little things that are going to evolve the profession quickly.
Okay,
if that makes sense.
So one of the things that I was really keen on probably even 2-3 years ago was the fact that I wanted to automate certain parts of what we do. And while I still say there's plenty of things that can be automated, I've kind of pulled back from that a little bit. There is, I want to automate, the clicking of buttons to create renderings and all that sort of stuff. But at one point I wanted to really, kind of generate a bunch of floor plans without having to really think about it. And the more that we went down that road, the more we realized that really wasn't all that valuable. That, the 2 or 3 really good solutions we kind of already knew as we developed something, right? And there's the technology that can help us visualize it, pull it forward, whatever that might be. But there was still that, the human interaction, right? The listening. You got to listen to the client. You got to listen to what everyone is talking about around you, what they're saying about while they're emoting about a space. Well, hey, this doesn't feel right. And so, okay, it doesn't feel right. What does that mean? How do we correct it? And I've kind of shied away from, well, we're going to do 300 versions of your floor plan in like a second. I do think that's cool, but I'm not sure there's huge value in that. What's your opinion on that?
So that's something I can definitely talk to. So, I mean, I don't think that human piece is going to go away, right? But there are companies out there like TestFit.io that is doing really interesting things with the low hanging fruit. Like there's only so many different iterations of a parking lot, honestly, that you want to draw. So that's I feel like that's an easy place to automate. And if they can spit out 100 iterations in the same time that it takes you to spit out one iteration, and then you have the ability to pick which 100 you want to go forward with, I think that saves time, right?
Yep.
There's no doubt in that. So for me, when we look at computer automation, I think it's just that. Like, I think there will continue to be tools that spits out so many more derivations than we could ever do that at a that's humanly possible. But then it's going to take our knowledge and knowing of the client and knowing what they're really looking for to look through all those derivations to then pull in what the scenarios are and move forward with the right one. So that's kind of where I think that speed and process and automation is going to really be impactful to design moving forward. In that sense, I do think, they're just, I feel like if I sat down with Bola, she and I could come up with just financial system automations, right? Yeah. That makes her life easier and your project accountant life easier. So I think there's things like that we can begin to automate. There's automation lessons that architecture firms can steal from other industries that we haven't done, right? I don't know of a lot of architecture firms who are able to run a very good marketing funnel, right? Because we're of the belief that so much of the work that we do is relationship driven, but still there has to be a starting point. How do you make that new introduction to that person, and how do you scale that? So though I feel like there's those type of automations that are going to creep in, that can actually, the firms that embrace it. And, the tool belt and just kind of what you guys are doing with VR is really interesting, because that, what you guys are enabling chefs to virtually cook in a kitchen and understand where their line of sight is being is not going to work for them, and just saying this shelf needs to be higher, like that in itself is it's not automation, but it's definitely bringing speed to the process with which you used to do things at, right?
Absolutely. There's no drawing you can do that says when I'm, hunched over a stove, what I can see, on the other side of a space, right? And that, absolutely, that, and yeah, you're right. It's not automation, but boy, does it get you to a decision a whole hell of a lot faster, especially if it has been built. If it's built and now you're hunching over the stove and you can't see where you need to see, now you're totally screwed.
And that change order is so much more expensive too at that point.
Exactly. So last question, kind of bringing it all back around. If you had to do it differently as far as your career is concerned, what might you have changed thus far?
I don't know if that's an interesting question, because I'm always one of those people that believe in moving forward rather than looking back. I ended up here because of the culmination of everything. I think if I were to give advice to anyone, I would be I think I would have gotten here faster if I took cues and looked back at the work that I really enjoyed doing. Mm-hmm. It took me a little bit longer to figure out what was my path forward. I really loved that studio, and about scenario planning, and it was engaging. It was really about taking a lot of different data from a lot of different unique sources, doing stakeholder engagements, talking with the people and the understanding the users and stuff. If I keyed into that sooner, I think I would have gotten here faster. So, just be aware of kind of what brings you joy and what gets you excited. And then it's just so much easier to follow your passion that way. But yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for being my guest here on the Anti-Architect podcast. To see and read more, obviously about Evelyn, you have your own website. It was evelynlee.com, right? Mm-hmm. And thepracticeofarchitecture.com, and make sure you check out her podcast, Practice Disrupted, pretty popular podcast on all of the channels. So thank you again so much for your time and having this conversation. It was great.